of both local and federal law enforcement to legally monitor their communications, even with a court order. I want to also mention that my colleagues in corrections have mentioned that there has been a marked and dramatic increase in the number of MS-13 gangs in our jails and prisons. This dramatic uptick in that population has impacted the ability for our corrections professionals to keep these individuals segregated. It's impacted staffing and the safety of corrections officers. Let me just finish by offering two recommendations to the committee to address this growing problem. First, I believe that Congress can and should fund federal, state, and local task forces to focus on gangs. They could be modeled after the Joint Terrorism Task Forces and should have a single, national, and coordinated infrastructure led primarily by a federal agency with significant input from local departments. These regional gang task forces will need the full spectrum of support, from centralized intelligence sharing and analysis to the prosecution in the U.S. Attorney's offices, where federal grand juries and firm sentencing have the greatest impact on disrupting these gangs. The Senate has previously enacted legislation to accomplish this purpose, but it was never approved by the House. Senator McCaskill, you mentioned that sometimes we have an impossible job. My last recommendation, I urge Congress to act to balance citizens' rights to privacy with law enforcement's needs to lawfully monitor and intercept electronic communications regarding criminal activity and potential deadly plots. The expanding issue of going dark must be addressed at the federal level to afford local law enforcement and our federal partners the legislation and the tools they need to legally access encrypted communications that are used to coordinate criminal activities. Thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you for the assistance that you provide law enforcement throughout our nation.
Thank you, Chief. And is it Manger?
Manger, yes.
Okay. Apologize for getting
50-50 shots.
2 out of 3 I was wrong. It's not unusual. Senator Langford has to leave, so I'll yield my position to Senator Langford.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Gentlemen, thank you not only for being here, for the preparation for this time, for the incredibly compelling testimony and the issues that you bring and the complexity of what you deal with every day. We appreciate your work very much. All three of you mentioned the interaction between MS-13 and what's happening in Central America. Several of you mentioned specifically the coordination efforts between Central America and law enforcement here, both federal and their law enforcement in that spot. What can we do to help facilitate greater cooperation, whether that be fingerprint sharing, identity, background information between individuals that are being deported here back there as they're trying to receive gang members back there, but also individuals that are moving this direction as well. So what coordination is missing? Because MS-13 obviously is a strong Central American, Salvadoran especially presence there. What can we do?
I would just say that you touched on a couple of things that we need to do. First, our ability to remove identified MS-13 gang members that have been arrested or convicted of crimes. Oftentimes we have, not only in Central America, but other nations in our world that will not accept their residents back, and we need to remove them from our country. And so if we can work on that issue, it would be very helpful. And as I mentioned in my testimony, that the truce that was in place between gangs in El Salvador and their government really did impact things in our country. And when that truce broke down, it had created a spike in violence in our country. So
what you're saying is that the gang truce broke down in El Salvador and affected the violence directly here in the United States?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What other resources, what other cooperation do we need from Central American countries?
I had the privilege to just return from El Salvador, and with my position with the FBI's task force, I've been able to go down there approximately half of a dozen times. I just returned as recently as Saturday. The FBI has in place in El Salvador the TAG, the Transnational Anti-Gang Group. Their success prompted them to have another tag placed in Honduras and Guatemala. What I believe we're seeing up in the metro Boston area is the inability to refer to a database that doesn't just cover local MS-13 members, but MS-13 members nationally as well as internationally. And I feel like a database that was, the input was from both El Salvador and the United States would assist in the vetting process of these unaccompanied children that are crossing the border. A lot of times in El Salvador, they have information that the individual may have gang ties, possibly not a member. And in return, in the United States, we have information that the individual has gang ties, whether or not he or she is a member. And it would be a great asset if that information found its way to a clearinghouse that they would have access to internationally and nationally, and even at the local level.
All three of you mentioned something along those lines. Is the FBI the correct depository for that? Because trying to set up something new, obviously, is an additional cost and bureaucracy and everything else. Is there enough of a relationship with the gang task forces locally with FBI and their gang task forces to say FBI should be tasked to be able to have this database, all local folks be able to have access to it, international and national?
In the metro Boston area, which I can speak on with confidence, we speak to the FBI tag in Central America, specifically Guatemala and El Salvador, on a weekly basis. The Massachusetts State Police speaks to the FBI tag in El Salvador and Guatemala, maybe even more often than that. So it would be my opinion that the FBI already has in place those resources, and to expand those resources would probably be the best course.
Okay. Mr.
I agree wholeheartedly, as I mentioned in my testimony, that this database is a mission critical to facilitating effective collaboration and eradicating these gangs from our communities here. What we're seeing for the first time on Long Island is direct connections with young gang members to El Salvador. So in the past, we've seen connections from gang members in Suffolk County and on Long Island to the West Coast. Now it's directly to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. So your question is directly on point. In addition to the database, I would just add, we work very closely with the FBI in Suffolk County through the FBI Safe Streets Task Force. However, a broad special operation division may also be worth taking a look at. My understanding is that is essentially a multi-agency organization, and that could be a division that could assist in this type of database. What's very helpful is when we have a number pop in Suffolk County, a phone number, and we share that with our federal partners abroad who have assets in Central America, and the type of analysis and intelligence that they can gain from a single number is both scary when you see all the connections, but extremely helpful.
Okay, so what is missing in this database that doesn't already exist? Because it sounds like the cooperation is there, the relationships are already there. What's missing in this database? Is it just that it hasn't been launched? Because the information's there.
It's my opinion that we have a series of individual databases that don't always connect nationally and internationally, and I think it would be an asset to be able to connect them internationally, again, because that would assist with us not only knowing who's coming into our community, but also would assist the governments within Central America to know at times who's coming back. And from conversations with government officials in El Salvador, that was one of the things that they were struggling with, is that as their resources, to include the FBI's tag, address the MS problem locally in El Salvador, and the may arrest 20, 25 individuals, they said it's just a short time later that a plane arrives and 50 more gang members are brought back to their country, and they have to continue the process again. So it's important to address the problem in El Salvador if we're going to take a real hard look at the problem that we're experiencing here in the United States.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, just a quick comment on this. This is something that the appropriations team has already started on. In fact, yesterday had a hearing on state and foreign office appropriations about Central America specifically, and some of the investments and the way that we're targeting, how we're spending money in our foreign aid, and how we need to be able to target this, specifically dealing with violence in those areas, because it has an exact connection to what's happening here. I would encourage cooperation between those two committees and whatever we can do with the FBI to be able to help them finish out this database.
Yeah, it sounds to be pretty much a common solution here, so we'll work together with you on that. Senator McCaskill.
When you all identify a gang member who is in this country illegally, are you getting immediate response from ICE for deportation?
When we arrest them, we typically do. We can identify them. It's not until that they are arrested, fingerprinted, the fingerprints go, get to Homeland Security, that they identify them as someone they would be interested in, yes.
And let me ask about the countries who won't take them back. I mean, are we, and the problem that you just laid out very well with us, you know, just when El Salvador arrests 25 leaders, we send them 50 more to take their place back from this country. Have we had any problem with either Guatemala or El Salvador refusing to take any of the people that we have arrested for gang activity here to send back there that are not in this country legally?
I wouldn't be the subject matter expert to answer that question. Have you all
ever encountered not being able to get rid of a gang member that you're holding because a country won't receive them back? In Massachusetts, and specifically in the task force that I work in, we haven't had a problem. We don't know of a problem where the country didn't take them back. There have been roadblocks at times when an individual committed a crime and was placed in custody, up for deportation, and the federal judge refused the order of deportation. But that would be completely different than the country not taking them back. Right. That's a whole other issue. I know you all have talked about money for regional task forces. I think this is one of those areas where we've got to be really careful with the budget the president presented, because while they're putting more money into border security, we can't forget that a lot of the HIDTA money, a lot of the money that Burn Grant money, I mean, you all know what these programs are because your departments depend on them, especially for interagency task forces. You know, having firsthand experience at this money is not wasted. This is not soft stuff. This is what's giving you the tools. So I just want to make that comment because the president's budget was not kind. The skinny budget and the new budget that's been presented was not always kind to programs like that. Let me ask you about prosecutors. You talked about, Commissioner Sinney, about more line U.S. attorneys, and I get that RICO has tools that local prosecutors don't have within the RICO umbrella. But are you getting cooperation from local prosecutors on these assaults, on these felonies? I mean, is there not enough cooperation from your local DAs on this? Because all of these crimes, obviously, are state crimes, not federal crimes. Assault is not even a federal crime. Really, murder isn't either. So I'm just curious what the local cooperation has been.
So as I mentioned before, the part of our strategy is to target these gang members and make street arrests. And I mentioned we've made over 200 MS-13 arrests. The vast majority of those arrests are prosecuted by our local district attorney's office. So in that regard, we get excellent cooperation from the district attorney's office. Where I would improve the collaboration among the police department, U.S. Attorney's Office, and District Attorney's Office is oftentimes you're able to develop probable cause and the ability to arrest an individual on local state murder charges much sooner than you're able to make a federal murder RICO charge. So what I would like to see if the machine was running perfectly is once we have PC, once we have probable cause to make that state murder charge, the person is arrested, prosecuted in the state system. If it turns out that we're able to make that into a federal RICO charge, bring that case over to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And it's a collaborative effort. Perhaps you have a special assistant district attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office and a special assistant district attorney.
So it's coordinated.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Improved screening and post-placement services was also one of your recommendations. I certainly am aware of the post-placement services issue. We had a whole hearing, Senator Portman and I did, in PSI about the incredible problem of HHS not really, I mean, there has been some, put the gang issue aside, there has been some horrendous treatment of these children in terms of being forced into child labor and other issues, and clearly I think that's someplace that we need to continue to focus on that. Let me finally just ask you, it's my understanding, Commissioner and Chief, that neither one of your departments will be participating in 287G. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And would you explain briefly why you will not be participating in 287G?
So, although we believe that it's mission critical to collaborate with the Department of Homeland Security to remove dangerous gang members from our streets, we also simultaneously have to create an environment in which undocumented individuals feel comfortable coming to law enforcement with information about crimes. So therefore, we do not, for example, inquire into the immigration status of those individuals who are coming to the police as a witness, as a victim, or someone merely seeking police assistance. In the same vein, we believe if we entered into a 287G agreement, that could compromise our mission in creating that environment and could hurt our ability to make cases, to encourage witnesses and victims to come forward. With that said, whenever we arrest an individual for a crime, misdemeanor or felony, and that person is not here legally, we automatically notify the Department of Homeland Security. So,
and Chief Manger, your department was listed on ICE's jurisdictions that supposedly didn't cooperate with them. Obviously, what the Commissioner just described is the ultimate cooperation. It's paying attention to your public safety mission, which has to be foremost. You're the only one that answers 911 calls. I'm not aware of anybody else in the entire criminal justice system that answers 911 calls besides your departments. And so what was the downfall of you being listed as a department that failed to cooperate with ICE, and what was the impact on your ability to, in fact, put criminals in prison?
We, the biggest challenge that I've had is to try and make sure that what a number of our elected officials have said has not been misinterpreted by our federal colleagues. The fact is, we are not now, nor have we ever been, a sanctuary jurisdiction. We have found, we believe, because as I mentioned, that Montgomery County is 1/3 immigrant when you look at our population. And I think the Commissioner described it perfectly. We've got to find that balance for what's right for public safety in our jurisdiction. If people are afraid to come forward and report crime, afraid to come forward to be witnesses to crime, our jurisdiction is less safe. So we've found that balance. We don't inquire about people's immigration status. However, if we arrest someone, we cooperate fully with ICE. We respond to every one of their inquiries. The issue where I think many jurisdictions run into the challenge, and we've been talking to Homeland Security about this forever, are the issue of the detainers. And I think many people look at the issue of whether we honor a detainer or not, that is, hold someone beyond when they would normally be released, as a political decision. It is not. It is a legal decision. We have been instructed by the Federal Circuit, Fourth Circuit. We have been given instructions by our attorneys that we can hold these folks until the time when they would be released. At that point, we will notify ICE they're being released. If ICE can come down and get them, they're welcome to them. We will notify ICE when they're going to be. We'll give them notice ahead of time when they're going to be released if we have that information. We had a case recently that ICE took the opportunity to put a press release out on saying that Montgomery County released a dangerous person back into the community. It was a mistake. We had a detainer. We should have honored it. It was unexpected that a judge was going to release this person, and we didn't notify ICE. So I say we, it was our corrections department. And it was a mistake. It was fixed the next day. The person was taken into custody the next day.
But that doesn't overcome the press release.
It does not overcome. But the fact of the matter is, we are doing the same thing that Suffolk County is doing, the same thing that about 90+% of the 18,000 police departments in this country are doing. We have found that balance where we do not want to be the immigration police, but we absolutely cooperate and help our federal partners.
And make no mistake, you guys are handling 95% of the violent crime that occurs in this country, not the federal authorities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'll take Senator Langford's question, then it'll be Senator Hassan. On that same line of questioning, is there any federal law that you'd want to see changed or modified to help you do your job as it relates to this gang activity and your dealing with the ICE in terms of detainers and immigration law?
I would love to see, we're bound by case law. And when we're informed that by our attorneys that we would be liable for false imprisonment if we do not release someone when they are entitled to be released, that's a problem. And so if there can be a change in the law that give those detainers the strength of a warrant, because if we have a warrant, we will hold someone. And that is, I believe, that the easiest solution is to get a warrant to hold somebody. That gives us the legal authority to do so.
So again, you're concerned about your liability. I've heard the same thing in terms of county sheriff's departments in Wisconsin as well. There's some civil cases out there that hold them liable if they detain people. So it's really giving you that liability protection if you actually detain people in this country illegally.
That's correct. And believe me, there's not a police department in this country that doesn't want to hold someone who is a danger to their community. And if we can use that person who has already committed a crime that has gotten them locked up in the first place, if we can use deportation as a tool for that individual, I'm perfectly happy to remove that person from my community. But I cannot run afoul of the law in doing that.
So I'm going to come back to the strategy of using deportation versus arresting and imprisonment. But I first want to get to something pretty basic. It was interesting being briefed for this. I've not been a prosecutor. I haven't been involved in the whole issue of gangs. My assumption going in is that MS-13 would have been primarily there as drug traffickers, human traffickers. Kind of splitting this out, the reason people join gangs, we've talked about, they don't have people here, they don't have family here, this is the type of family, but they're also extorted to join the gang as well. Can you just tell me, what is the purpose of MS-13? I mean, from the gang's perspective, why are they recruiting, why are they extorting, what is their main activity? I'll start with you, Commissioner.
Sure. They recruit to sustain themselves, and they are a criminal organization, and their main objective is to exist and to be feared. And there's no question that they engage in criminal economic activity. Many of them sell drugs. Many of them commit extortion, robberies, burglaries. But they don't engage in that. They don't engage in those criminal activities as their primary purpose of existence.
Do you understand how that's just surprising? I mean, to hear that, their main purpose is just to exist, to be an entity, to have people loyal to them, and the loyalty extends to macheting people to death. I mean, does everybody else agree with that? Is that the main purpose?
Just to add to what the Commissioner said, we have to look at MS-13 in the United States as it evolves. Just like we have to look at MS-13 in El Salvador as it evolved. On the East Coast of the United States, MS-13 is just getting a foothold. On the West Coast of the United States, like Senator McCaskill and Senator Johnson have said, they've been there for decades. And we actually imported MS-13 back to El Salvador. But now they have begun to evolve. And on the West Coast, they do control drug trafficking markets. They do have connections with other criminal organizations, such as the Mexican Mafia, La MA. In El Salvador, almost everybody pays. Almost everybody pays some sort of extortion payment to MS-13. In some cases, it might be as little as $1. But when a household in El Salvador might only bring in $250, that $1 is pretty significant. So we need to learn from the patterns of MS-13 on the West Coast and the patterns of the criminal activity of MS-13 in El Salvador to be prepared for what MS-13 is ultimately going to try to put into place on the East Coast. So to piggyback what the Commissioner said, as of right now, they are just maintaining. And they really do just go out and commit the most heinous of violent acts, some of which, as a 22-year investigator, I've never investigated before, to include cutting off of limbs, the attempt to cut off a victim's head with the machete. So at this moment on the East Coast and in Boston, like the Commissioner said, some of them are employed. Some of them go to work at 6 o'clock in the morning. If you go into certain restaurants in Boston to arrest an MS-13 member, sometimes the business owner says he was one of my best workers. So right now, they're maintaining, they're getting their numbers up, and we can see that from the Metro Boston area all the way down to Charlotte. But they are going to evolve, and they are going to attempt to take over trafficking markets of narcotics, just like they have in the West Coast and just like they have in Central America.
So again, they have different specialties. In El Salvador, it's extortion. In the West Coast, it is drug trafficking. And we're not quite sure how it evolves. You would suspect it'd be drug trafficking, human trafficking.
I believe on the East Coast, they're still trying to get leadership into the right places, to include Boston, Long Island, Virginia, the Carolinas. And I think once they establish that leadership base, you will start to see a more sophisticated gang that doesn't just solely commit violent acts, but also controls some sort of narcotics market and possibly even illegal trafficking.
So let me ask how they differ and how they are similar with other major gangs. Maybe Chief Manger can answer that.
Our neighborhood crews, which are not ethnic based, that is, they are more diverse in terms of their membership. They are the ones that typically have, when we have homicides relating to those, it's usually drug related. The homicides related to MS-13, it's just because we can and because we will and because we want to instill that fear. It's because if you're not my gang, then you're my enemy and I'm going to kill you. The economic support that MS-13 was engaged in was very unsophisticated for a long time. It was, we're going to rent an apartment in some old apartment building, and we're going to put a couple of young women in there and get, $20, for every guy that wants to come in. And this would operate for about a week. And when it would finally come to our attention, we'd be able to shut that down. It would just pop up somewhere else. Not very sophisticated. And it was usually, they were extorting money and making money from unlawful operations. Now they're going to Latino-owned businesses and charging them rent. And they're using coercion, fear, threats, and threats that the victims know that these people have the ability and willingness to carry out, to now extort money from legitimate business. This is a trend that we're seeing more recently.
Real quick, because I did just want to ask you, you talked about the instance of a couple individuals lured through the internet to their deaths. Was that an initiation right? I mean, why would they lure individuals on just to kill them?
In one case, it was because they believed that individual was part of a rival gang.
Okay.
In another case, it was that this individual had been approached and had been resistant to joining MS-13. So it was basically to teach them a lesson. No more reason than that.
Senator Hassan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member. for this hearing. And first of all, to the three of you, thank you for your service as law enforcement officers, and please thank your families for all of us, too. I'm the former governor of New Hampshire, and I had the great privilege of being the chief executive over the New Hampshire State Police. So I am very appreciative of the time, effort, commitment that you all provide to your fellow citizens. And I'm very grateful for your testimony today. I'm very grateful for not only for the information, but the suggestions and recommendations. I think they will help all of us as we work together to combat this gang and other public safety threats. I did want to look at or delve into a little bit more some of the discussion of what we think the root causes of gang violence are. We know we have to ensure that our federal, state, and local law enforcement officers have the resources necessary to keep our communities safe, and I thank you for your recommendations in that regard. But to touch on something that Commissioner Cini talked about a little bit, having a strong law enforcement presence in our communities is only really one part of the solution. We have to ensure, too, that there are social and education programs in place and that those are adequately resourced to try to divert young people away from joining gangs in the first place. So in my state, one of the important social programs that has helped us to address youth violence was a mentorship program between police and students. It's known as MPAL, Paired Cops with Kids in